This is Jed Disler, and welcome to The Piano Maven, your friendly podcast guide to piano recordings. I've been appreciating all of your support since we started this podcast more than a year and a half ago, and I invite you to consider taking a paid subscription, which will help keep this podcast alive and afloat. And paid subscribers get a free download at the beginning of each month, so that's well worth considering. And I have a link to subscribe in our episode description. At this moment, I am staring not just out of the window of my studio and looking at this upcoming blizzard that is starting to manifest itself, but I'm also looking around the room, and there's a big box of CDs that I eventually will have to file away among the many piano box sets that are sitting on my shelves. And because everything's alphabetized on my shelves, whenever I add a box, especially when it's a big box, I have to move dozens of other boxes to make room to keep the alphabet intact. And if I miscalculate the room because of the alphabetizing, then I have to go back to the drawing board and refile everything again. It's a total pain to do this, but if my collection wasn't so well organized, I would go totally nuts. I mean, I am totally nuts, but you know what I mean. So maybe you remember, or maybe you already have in your collection, a box set that came out in 2021. It had 41 CDs in it. It consisted of the complete Decca recordings by the pianist Friedrich Gulda. And this box also contained some, but not all, of Gulda's releases for the Amadeo label, including his Beethoven sonata cycle from the late 1960s. I suppose that was included as a complement to the Beethoven cycle that he did for Decca in the 1950s. I wrote the booklet notes for that 2021 release. Now we fast forward several years, and now we have, under the banner of Deutsche Grammophon, the Friedrich Gulda edition on 84 CDs, all packaged in original jacket facsimiles. Essentially, this is Friedrich Gulda's entire discography covering all of the labels controlled by Universal Classics, Universal Music. So let me break it down for you. Let me tell you what we have here. The first 14 discs cover Gulda's releases that appeared on Deutsche Grammophon. Then discs 15 through 50 gather together all of the releases originally issued by Amadeo and also issued on the MPS label. CDs 51 through 74 are all those releases that originally appeared on Decca, on 78s and LPs, and in a few cases on CD. Discs 75 through 82 are all releases that first appeared. Discs 75 through 82 are all releases that first appeared on Philips, and these include the early 1970s recordings of Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier, which actually was an Amadeo production, but it did turn up on Philips in the 1980s, so I guess that's why it's in the Philips section. I mean, I have no idea. And then the two final discs contain Friedrich Gulda's 1993 recital from Montpellier that first appeared on the Accord label, and Accord is controlled by Universal. My first idea was to go through this box disc by disc, David Hurwitz style, taking out big clumps of discs and then looking at them in order and then saying, okay, Gulda's Chopin preludes, these are good, these are fun to have. But I thought it might be better to follow the trajectory of the Grammophon review I wrote for this box set and to give you an overall perspective, because that I think might be a little more helpful. When Gulda signed with Decca in the late 1940s, he was still a teenager, but he seemed to be fully formed artistically, and his earliest recordings reveal a pianist with strong ideas. In fact, some of his earliest Bach recordings have a dryness and directness that kind of foreshadow Glenn Gould in some ways, and they also foreshadow the X-ray clarity and the rhythmic sternness of his complete Well-Tempered Clavier from the early 1970s that I mentioned a minute ago. But Gulda's recording from the late 1940s of the Prokofiev Seventh Sonata, which was the work's second recording ever, is surprisingly effective. It's brilliantly played, it's really intelligently shaped, and this is quite interesting when you consider that this music was relatively new and it was only just starting to enter the international repertoire. And among Gulda's 78s for Decca include some Chopin selections, and the Berceuse, the Third Ballade, and the Etudes Opus 25 numbers 1 and 2 reveal a much more limpid and quote-unquote traditional kind of Chopin compared to Gulda's relatively forthright E minor concerto and his early 50s cycles of the Four Ballades and the Preludes, Opus 28. And there also are live Chopin Preludes, Opus 28, that appeared on Deutsche Grammophon many, many years after the fact. I think that Gulda's studio Chopin Preludes for Decca fascinate because of their avoidance of a lot of interpretive traditions that became cliches. I can give you one example. You know, the Prelude number 17 has that introduction of chords ba 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 da 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 dum. Before the melody starts, you have those chords ba 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 ba. Most pianists make a retard at the end of those chords, even though no retard is written. But Gulda just plays it straight. Interestingly, Rudolf Serkin plays it straight, so maybe that's the German-Austro way of doing it. I don't know. But generally, one did not associate Gulda with Chopin, nor with the French Impressionists. But there are some interesting Debussy and Ravel performances in this box to reckon with. I remember being totally thrown for a loop when Philips reissued Gulda's 1950s Decca, Debussy, and Ravel recordings in that Great Pianists of the 20th Century series. You remember that? Gulda's Debussy Preludes from the early 50s on Decca, I thought yielded nothing in color and nuance to Walter Gieseking's much more famous contemporaneous accounts. And I think that in some ways they surpassed Gieseking in regard to pinpointed accuracy and virtuosic selections like What the West Wind Saw in Preludes Book 1, or in Book 2, Les Tiresses Alternées and Feux d'Artifice. Gulda's Suite Bergamasque, I think, is one of the most perfectly paced and eloquently articulated interpretations that I know on disc. But he tends to pedal a little too much in Pour le Piano and in parts of Ravel's Sonatine. Now, Gulda's Decca recording of Gaspard de la Nuit of Ravel may not be the most diabolical interpretation around, but his controlled cool and his textural transparency really contrast to those hyper-virtuosic performances that we hear today from young competition hotshots. And there are also some absorbing live performances of Gaspard de la Nuit with Gulda floating around the date from the 1950s. There was a box on the Andante label that has a Gaspard de la Nuit. I'm going to talk about that release in another episode. Gulda, by the way, remade the Debussy preludes for MPS or for Amadeo or one of those labels. I can't remember. But these later versions were kind of dry sonically as well as interpretively, and they're in this box set, but I honestly don't care for them. However, Gulda's reputation as an interpreter largely lies within the German Austro repertoire, with music of Beethoven and Mozart occupying the bulk of this collection. Let's get to the Beethoven first. There's the cycle of the 5 piano concertos recorded in the early 1970s with the Vienna Philharmonic under the direction of Horst Stein. These performances are beautifully engineered, although I think the interpretations are uneven, and the unevenness sometimes occurs within the same work. For instance, the 4th concerto has a really brisk and perky rondo finale, but the long first movement, by contrast, just seemed so bland and uneventful. I guess I should talk more about this cycle in detail in another episode. And eventually, I will have to compare Gulda's 2 commercial Beethoven sonata cycles. One was for Decca, mixing mono and stereo recordings, all from the 1950s. And then there was the cycle that he re-recorded in stereo for Amadeo in the late 60s. And the Amadeo performances generally are tighter and harder hitting. Probably that has to do with the closer microphone placement. I personally prefer the 1953 and 1954 Beethoven Sonata cycle that Gulda recorded for German radio that was issued on the Orfeo label. Gulda did not like these performances as much as I do, but I know better, ha ha ha. But I guess I'm going to have to do an episode doing a 3-way comparison between the 3 Gulda Beethoven Sonata cycles. And there are some standalone singleton Beethoven Sonata performances in the box. There's also a rather closely microphoned Diabelli variations that was on MPS on LP. I kind of remember that. I think it turned up on Harmonium Mundi on LP. It's kind of dry, and it's really not my favorite Diabelli variations, to be honest. The Diabellis in the Orfeo box, I think, is much, much better. But I should mention, though, that if you want to hear Beethoven's Waldstein Sonata pounded out to smithereens, you got to listen to Gulda's Amadeo recording. It is a weird recording, if there ever was one. And his Appassionata is also driven to extremes, I think. Now let's talk about Mozart. In 1982, Gulda recorded a Mozart sonata cycle that never appeared during his lifetime, and it only survived in the form of cassette dubs that were made from master tapes, and the master tapes are presumably lost. Deutsche Grammophon posthumously issued them as the Mozart tapes. And in this cycle, Gulda left out that hybrid Crucial 533-494 sonata, and curiously, he omitted the Crucial 309 sonata because he questioned its authenticity. Now, it takes a little doing to get past pockets of tape hiss and wow and flutter and occasional signal overload, along with very close miking that transforms Gulda's Bösendorfer grand piano into a strange kind of harpsichord piano hybrid, and it has a kind of fuzzy and not very appealing patina. And this cycle, I think, reveals Gulda more as a Mozartian rocker rather than a Mozartian lyric poet. And the left hand represents a very emphatic rhythm section with Alberti basses being sculpted and almost pounded out with endless variety, and the bass octaves turn into dramatic devices. And Gulda brings out a lot of melodies within decorative passages, which is kind of cool. Slow movements are more like dances rather than arias. And I think this approach is interesting, although it works better to listen in small doses. If you listen to 3 or 4 sonatas in one sitting, you're going to get tired. Unfortunately, Gulda plays the C minor Kochel 457 sonata on a clavinola, which is an electronic keyboard, and it has these cheesy, sustained, synthesized string sounds, and it really turns the music into muzak. Ugh. I much prefer Gulda's conventionally engineered Deutsche Grammophon studio recording of this work, which was originally coupled with the D major Kochel 576 and the B flat Kochel 570 sonatas, and this is a really good disc. But in general, when it comes to Mozart and Gulda, I think his earlier performances are better. The Decca versions, for instance, of the A minor sonata Kochel 310, and I like the Decca version of 576 much better than the DG remakes. Some of you may know the recording that Gulda made in the early 1960s of the C major concerto Kochel 467, the Elvira Madigan concerto, and he played in that recording the slow movements right-hand lines in and around the beat, which he said was in keeping with the definition of rubato according to Mozart, in Mozart's time. It's like a jazz singer who is phrasing ahead of and behind the beat, as if Frank Sinatra was singing the melody. But when Gulda re-recorded 467 for Deutsche Grammophon with Claudio Abbado conducting, he played the movement straight, so I guess he abandoned this Frank Sinatra idea. I guess he changed his mind over the years, or maybe he decided just not to be provocative for a change. Who knows? But Gulda's recordings of the D minor 466 and the D major Coronation Concerto Kochel 537 and the last concerto, the one in B flat Kochel 595, all with Abbado and the Vienna Philharmonic, are excellent performances, and those have really stood the test of time. There are some collaborations in this collection that I should note. For instance, there was that famous recital of songs of Richard Strauss with the soprano Hilda Gruden. And there was a very good Beethoven sonata cycle with Gulda and the cellist Pierre Fournier. I actually prefer Fournier's Deutsche Grammophon remakes with Wilhelm Kempff. And then you have all kinds of mixed recitals with very idiosyncratic programming. For example, there was a collection called The Complete Musician. It was a 5 LP set. I think it was on Amadeo. I'm pretty sure it was. And for this collection, Gulda went into his home studio and simply played whatever came into his head without planning, from Beethoven and Schubert sonatas to some rather rambling improvisations. But this box set contains a much wider variety of Gulda's work as a jazz pianist, composer, and bandleader that we have ever had on CD. And for Gulda, jazz was not a pastime. He was really serious about it. And he got better and better at jazz over the years. So we have in this box set these mid-1950s recordings from the New York club Birdland. And they show Gulda to be very talented, but maybe a little stiff in the idiom. But he soon blossomed into a genuine master. And his big band compositions from the 1960s and 70s reveal really formidable mastery and total stylistic absorption of the kind of knock-'em-dead brass writing that you get from, let's say, Maynard Ferguson's big band. But you also get the kind of contrapuntal sophistication that you hear in George Russell's work from the 1950s and early 1960s. There's also a terrific 1964 jazz trio session featuring Gulda's own compositions. And there's a 1971 concert where he collaborated on both piano and electric piano in duets with his fellow Austrian composer and pianist colleague Fritz Pauer. There's also this fantastic two-piano concert with Chick Corea from 1983, where they really are interacting and meshing spontaneously, and sometimes it's hard to tell who is playing what. This concert has really held up very well, and I think it also says a lot that Gulda could recruit big jazz names for his big band projects, because you will find participating musicians such as Phil Woods, Freddie Hubbard, Ron Carter, Mel Lewis, J.J. Johnson, and many others. There's also a bonus DVD that contains the 1981 concert film Solo Flight, and there's a very good 2002 documentary that's called So What? And also, there's a lengthy and very interesting interview from 1986 with Gulda speaking with the journalist Joachim Kaiser. However, the big question remains, do you need all 84 CDs in this box? How often you will return to certain discs over others is definitely an open question. But there really isn't any disputing that the Friedrich Gulda edition does full justice to this complex and confrontational and multifaceted and multi-talented musician's career and his determination to break boundaries. This is Jed Disler, and you've been listening to The Piano Maven, your friendly podcast guide to piano recordings. And I hope you will get a chance to at least sample this box set. I mean, we have gallons of Gulda here on 84 CDs. Take good care, and I look forward to being with you for our next episode.